Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all here, joining us for this very important session on media freedom, the rule of law, and democracy in Hong Kong. I'm Helena Kennedy. I'm a senior lawyer in the United Kingdom. I'm the director also of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. And we're here specifically talking about the case of an incredible man, Jimmy Lai, and his newspaper, Apple Daily, which was closed down. Jimmy himself is now in prison, and he's facing very, very serious charges later this year. I don't have to tell a sophisticated audience like all of you that democracy is about more than voting. It is also sustained by other key pillars: the rule of law, media freedom, and having a vibrant civil society. And a vibrant civil society only comes about when human rights are protected, people have the right to protest, people have the right to strengthen their democracy. Hong Kong was, as you will all know, a colony of the United Kingdom. And it was in 1997 that China and the UK signed an international treaty which made Hong Kong a special administrative region of China. But that treaty was making it clear that democracy was to be protected within Hong Kong, and its culture of democracy and civil liberties be protected, and the rule of law. The years that have followed have meant that that agreement has slowly but surely been eroded. And we've seen within recent times attacks being made upon the rule of law, the introduction, an attempted introduction of extradition to China if China wanted people to be brought there for trial. And now the national security law, which has been introduced, which has really draconian measures. Jimmy Lai's case symbolizes a serious threat to the rule of law, to human rights and democracy in Hong Kong. And we're very lucky to have this panel of experts to talk about what it means when people's liberty and freedom is taken from them and when democracy begins to disappear. I have, as I've said, a terrific panel for you today. I'm going to start with telling you a bit about Sebastien Lai, who sits here to my left. Sebastien is Jimmy Lai's son. Jimmy was a renowned media entrepreneur, a writer, and a pro-democracy campaigner who founded Next Digital and Apple Daily, the popular independent Chinese language newspaper in Hong Kong. It was forcibly shut down by the Hong Kong authorities in 2021. Jimmy Lai has been imprisoned in Hong Kong since 2020, and he faces the rest of his life behind bars. Sebastien is leading the campaign to secure his release. To my right is sitting Caoilfhionn Gallagher. Caoilfhionn is a jewel in the legal firmament, not just of the United Kingdom, but internationally. She is a really brilliant, celebrated international human rights lawyer and an expert in journalist safety and media freedom. She practices as a barrister from Doughty Street Chambers, and I'm happy to say I'm a colleague of hers there. And over the past 20 years, she's acted in many landmark human rights cases, not just in the United Kingdom, but internationally, before international courts, the European Court of Human Rights and other courts, and UN bodies, as well as international tribunals. She has acted for and secured the freedom of many detained journalists, and you will know of her work, I'm sure. You'll have heard about her work for Maria Ressa. She, with Amal Clooney, have been acting for Maria, the Nobel Peace Prize winner. She's also acted for the 150 BBC Persian news Persian journalists, basically transmitting to Iran, who have been targeted extraterritorially. And she's been acting also in the case of Jimmy. Caoilfhionn is also Ireland's Special Rapporteur on Children and Child Protection, and she sits part-time as a coroner in England and Wales, is on the many advisory boards, and is, as I say, an extraordinary human rights lawyer. And we have with us flown in just today and still tired but full of enthusiasm for being with you, Jason Rezaian, who writes for the Washington Post. He's their global opinions, one of their leading commentators. He served as the bureau chief in Tehran for the Washington Post from 2012 to 2016. And it's wonderful to see him here today because I saw him not long after he had been arrested by the Iranian authorities, imprisoned for 544 days, and was eventually released and wrote his memoir, which I would recommend to you all. So we have a great deal of experience of one kind or another on this platform, and I'm now going to ask for a piece of film to be shown to you in which you will get a sense of Jimmy Lai.
My father was in prison because for 25 years he published the truth about what was happening in Hong Kong and in China.
And one of the important things about Jimmy Lai, who is of course a British citizen, he stands up for the values that we believe in, which sustain our democracy and our way of life.
Hong Kong is the place right now with such a clear contrast between the values and the way of organizing society that we, and I think most Asians, would like to see in their societies, and the Chinese Communist Party model. So if you want to look at what the Chinese Communist Party thinks the rest of the world ought to look like, you just look at what they're doing in Hong Kong.
What's important about this case is what it symbolizes in terms of the decline of journalism, press freedom, access to information in Hong Kong.
As a writer, I find freedom of speech crucial. I am very concerned about what's happening to Jimmy Lai, and therefore I find his entire struggle and his entire story very relevant also for other parts of the world.
There's a particularly strong connection, I think, between freedom of speech and the rule of law. And it's not surprising that the most corrupt, not the only corrupt, but the most corrupt societies are invariably those that don't have a free press.
There's an authoritarian playbook, and as a human rights lawyer I see it in so many places. And what happens is that authoritarians go after their critics, and then they go after not just journalists, but they go after the very publishing houses. That has implications for all of us. We need to know what's happening in our world.
You should care about what happened to Jimmy, because it could happen to any journalist anywhere. And without a free and independent media, we, as the public, are not free.
When things happen that are wicked, you have to call them out. And what's happening to Jimmy Lai at the moment is wicked. And we shouldn't forget that. We have to do business with China, but we should never stop calling them out when they do things which are plainly wrong.
So in the joint declaration, the Chinese Communist Party agreed to observe and accept the distinctive freedoms that made Hong Kong the special place that it was. It is now decided that those freedoms do not need to be observed and are subject to the whims of the political authorities. If I were an American or a British company with heavy exposure in Hong Kong, I would be very concerned.
If you see this video and take nothing else from it, just know that through Dad's case, China is just forcing their lies down everyone's throat. Is with how they are slicing through their legal system to get to my father.
Most civil societies use the rule of law as the basis on which to govern. If you turn and subvert those laws against the people, then you're basically engaging in lawfare. And lawfare is exactly what's happening against Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily and Next Digital and probably many other companies.
So Jimmy Lai's case is emblematic. He is the highest profile political prisoner in Hong Kong. And his case has been designed to send a message and to have a chilling impact on others, to other journalists, to human rights activists, to all those who believe in freedom. Stay silent or you'll be next.
Jimmy Lai might be someone you've never met or you haven't heard of before watching this, but if you fight for justice for him, then you're fighting for it everywhere. You're just fighting for that principle, for enforcement of it globally.
In a person's life, there's a few moments when you sort of get the chance to stand up for what you say and what you believe in. And that's why he chose to stay and stand with Hong Kong and its people.
If we don't speak out for those who are punished for speaking truth to power, then we are all in some way complicit in their persecution.
I wish the British government had been as firm and eloquent on Jimmy Lai's behalf as the US State Department has been, or as the European Parliament has been, or as the European External Action Service has been. And the very least we should do is to make sure that the name Jimmy Lai is on more foreign ministers' lips and more government leaders' lips over the next months.
If you don't shine a light on my father's case and you don't shine a light on Hong Kong, then these tyrants, they win.
It's important that everyone else out there who cares about freedom, who cares about democracy, fights for justice and the release of Jimmy Lai. Otherwise, anything we say about press freedom, about democracy, about our love for it is just hot air. We have to put those words into action.
Sebastien, it's a shocking business what's happened to your father, and I think we all admire the way in which you have stepped forward to be his voice to the wider world. Tell us a bit about him. Tell us about your father's start in life, because he was actually born inside China, wasn't he?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for giving me this platform to talk about my father's story. It's a real honor. Actually, before coming to Perugia, I gave it a Google and I read the Wikipedia page, and I found that it's known for its chocolate. And this is going to come back because it's actually quite a poetic part of his story. So my father was born in China, actually a year before the communists came to Guangzhou, and his dad was a businessman, so when the communists came, they took everything away from my grandfather, and my grandfather had to escape to Hong Kong. And my grandmother, because she was married to a businessman and was literate, she was essentially put in re-educational camps, which I don't really know what that means, right? So my father, at the age of 5, had to essentially fend for himself with his 2 sisters. And at a very young age, he had to become the man of the house. So he picked up odd jobs, and he ended up being a porter for a train station. So back then, you essentially get paid with tips. So you'd help people with the baggages, and then they'll tip you any amount they think is worth it for your service. And one day, a very well-dressed man, instead of giving him money, turned around and gave him half a bar of chocolate. And my dad, being very hungry, because everybody was in those times, turned around because he was tired, he didn't want to eat in front of someone, and ate it. And so he had never had chocolate before. I don't know if you remember the first time you've had chocolate, but for an 11-year-old, he thought it was the most amazing thing he's ever tasted. And he thought, well, China can't be the best place in the world if I've never had this before. So he turns around to the man and asks, so where are you from? And the person says, well, I'm from Hong Kong. And Dad thought, well, then Hong Kong must be heaven. Mm-hmm. And that was the day he decided that he was going to escape China and move to Hong Kong. And the whole process took a year and a bit before he finally landed in Hong Kong. And the first day he landed, to pay back for his boat fees, he went straight to work. So he went to work as a manual laborer at a textile factory. And it's a long story, and I don't think I have the time for this, but essentially he ended up running his own textile manufacturing plant in his 30s. And at one point, actually, he was apparently one of the biggest knitwear manufacturers in the world, because Hong Kong was a textile center. So maybe maybe your parents or your grandparents would have worn something that either he made by hand or at least his company made. After that, he founded a clothing brand called Giordano. Again, the Italian sort of link to that. It really wasn't that he, I mean, obviously he loves coming to Italy, but it wasn't really because of that. It was because he thought with the Italian name, people would think that it was a very fancy clothing brand. And Giordano is sort of this precursor to a Uniqlo, for example, where you'd essentially have very good quality clothing at a very cheap price. And that was tremendously successful, especially when Asia was growing at a rapid pace. And this led to the democratic protests in China. So Dad was very optimistic about the protests in China because a lot of his success he gave to the freedoms that Hong Kong had given him. So he sort of extrapolated that and thought, well, what if the whole of China had these freedoms? This place would explode in a good way. Sorry. And so when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, it was a huge blow to him, and as a result, he decided to start Apple Daily. So Apple Daily was started a year after I was born in 1995, and its core was essentially was the idea that you needed objective information in order to have. You needed the truth in order to make a conscious decision. So it was a newspaper that didn't pander to the powerful, always stuck to their guns, and wasn't scared of any threats. And my father and his colleagues ran true to this principle for 25 years and more until his arrest. Now, so I haven't seen him since 2020, end of 2020, when he was imprisoned. And I'm sure Keelan will go much more into this afterwards, but essentially he was first imprisoned for unlawful assembly. Now, what is unlawful assembly? Essentially, he lit a candle at a Tiananmen Square vigil, and for that he got, I think, almost a year. And so now he's still in prison after having finished serving those sentences for what is essentially a lease violation, and for that he's getting 5 years and 9 months. So his NSL trial is coming up in September, and that has a possibility of life imprisonment. But before I leave you and pass the mic over to Keelan, there was an anecdote that happened when they arrested my father and his colleagues, and I'll remember this for the rest of my life, because the day after the arrest, people lined up to buy the newspaper, and a journalist interviewed one man and asked, "So aren't you scared? This is almost going to be illegal. Are you still going to buy the newspaper?" And the man turns around to him and says, in Cantonese, "O bati du mai," which translates to, "I'll buy it even if it's a blank piece of paper." And that's very Hong Kong. Thank you.
And it's because it became a symbol.
Yeah.
And that's what not only Apple Daily was for so many people buying it. It was a symbol of belief in democracy and resistance, and that's what your father stands for. And even today, that sense that he stands for something that is being taken away from Hong Kongers is the whole thing about the campaigning around Jimmy Lai. Jimmy's in his 70s. I mean, how old is your dad now?
75.
75. Yeah. And yet he is absolutely stalwart. He knows there's a possibility that he might end his days in prison, but that's how it's going to be. I really urge all of you to find, there's a film now available freely, and it's Jimmy's life, and it's an incredible story, and he appears in it himself, speaking, because it was made before he was jailed. Keelan, tell the story of just how law is being abused, because we talk about the NSL, it's the national security law, and what the implications of that really are.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're conscious that we're competing with many other panels, and we're very grateful to you for coming today to talk about this remarkable man, Jimmy Lai, in prison in Hong Kong because he's a journalist, because he's a writer, because he's a media owner, and because he is a peaceful pro-democracy campaigner. And he is, of course, as you've heard, also a British citizen in prison because he's a journalist, a writer, a media owner, a peaceful pro-democracy campaigner. You've also heard how Apple Daily, the newspaper he founded, expressly pro-democracy and anti-corruption from the outset when it was founded, and the main Chinese language independent newspaper in Hong Kong was forced to close after 26 years of operation, after authorities arrested 5 of its senior executives, froze the company's assets, as well as Mr Lai's assets, leaving the newspaper with no choice but to close. And at that time, when Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee put the company out of business by freezing its bank accounts, at the time he was the Secretary for Security, he signed the company's death warrant, essentially, stating that he had reason to believe that the company had violated the national security law. Now, 2 years on, there hasn't even been a trial or any court finding about whether there's a violation of the national security law. Those claims haven't even been tested in court. But the printing presses have stopped, and they've actually been sold off in a fire sale by the authorities. This is state-sponsored theft of a media company, of a hugely successful and important media company. So it's targeting the company, and it's targeting Mr Lai. So not just going after individual journalists, going after the publishing houses, as Helena said so powerfully in the film that you saw. Seems to me that Amnesty International was quite right when they described the closure of Apple Daily in 2021 as the blackest day for Hong Kong's democracy. It's an extreme, chilling demonstration of the authorities' campaign to silence all opposition voices, use the law to curb dissent, a chilling form of lawfare which has resulted in Sebastian's father being behind bars for over 2 years, and Apple Daily stopping, and the printing presses stopping. And if I can just say at the outset, we're talking about one remarkable man. We've 2 rather remarkable other men on the panel too. But Sebastien, by speaking out in the way that he is now, Sebastian's in a position himself where he has also been threatened by the authorities. We spoke addressing the United Nations in Geneva a number of weeks ago. Sebastien gave a powerful statement about the importance of human rights standards being applied and his father being freed. And what we then got was a very aggressive statement from the authorities in Hong Kong saying that Sebastien Lai and the international legal team themselves are committing offences. So that's what you get. So by speaking out, Sebastien himself is being targeted, the legal team, the international legal team is also being targeted. And the ramifications of that are very stark, because that message that sends is that if Sebastien ever dared to step foot back within Hong Kong to try to see his father, he may well be targeted himself. So what we're talking about here is a 75-year-old, very brilliant man behind bars, facing potentially the rest of his life behind bars. We're facing potentially seeing a British citizen and a renowned journalist and media owner and writer dying behind bars for his journalism, for his writing. And we're certainly seeing the very real prospect of Sebastien not being able to see his father again. And it's why it's so incredibly important that everyone in this room does all they can to speak out and say how important this case is. Seems to me fitting that we're having this conversation in this very beautiful venue. My Italian is pretty terrible, so I'll probably mispronounce it, but it's the Auditorium San Francesco al Prato, and it's named after St. Francis of Assisi, as many of you will know. And he, of course, was someone who was amongst his country's rich and powerful, but risked it all for his beliefs. He spoke truth to power, was jailed for speaking truth to power. He was an outspoken and controversial social activist, And when he spoke out about corruption, he ended up in prison. And he also decided to go on and live a life of poverty as a friar in order to live by his beliefs. He risked it all for his beliefs. And there's even a link to Jimmy Lai's clothing business, with St. Francis having been the son of a cloth merchant. So I thought that was quite an interesting background. Now, in an interview in 2019 in the New York Times, which I'd urge you all to read, before he was imprisoned, Jimmy Lai described how, in 1989, he was so motivated by what he saw, the horrors he saw with Tiananmen Square, that he felt, although he was a very successful clothing magnate, as you've heard, he felt he needed to use his platform and use his power to create a media company. And that's why in 1990 he then founded Next Digital, Next Magazine, and then in 1995 Apple Daily, the newspaper, followed. So he did that precisely because he was so motivated by seeing what happened to people in Tiananmen Square, and he felt that their story needed to be told. And he felt very strongly that their story needed to be told in independent journalism, but in Chinese language. And that's why many of you in the room may not necessarily have read all of his writings, because he wrote primarily and he published primarily not in English. But that's one of the other reasons why this is so fundamentally important. Now, right from the outset, when he founded his media company, he was speaking truth to power and holding the authorities in Beijing to account. He wrote a lot about China's then Prime Minister, the late Li Peng, widely known as the Butcher of Beijing, and immediately the authorities started targeting him for his journalism, for his writing, for what his media companies were publishing. They started targeting his clothing business, for example, and then over the decades we saw him targeted in multiple ways. So his home and his business were firebombed. He received horrendous abuse and threats. His advertisers were targeted as well in an attempt to economically strangle him. So we saw multiple attacks. But what we've seen since 2019 is now the law being used to target him too. Now, I mentioned that 2019 interview, and it's quite interesting because what he said in that 2019 interview with the New York Times, he said he understood why so many of his fellow businessmen, particularly in 2019 with the protests in Hong Kong, why they made empty statements against the protesters because they felt under pressure to do so from the authorities. And he said, while that was understandable, it was a mistake. And this is what he said: China's leaders know that once they cow you, they can always cow you. Once they have you in their pocket, they will always squeeze you. Well, Mr. Lai has certainly not been cowed. He's certainly not in the authorities' pocket. For that, he's been targeted for decades, and he now faces the rest of his life behind bars. I want to make 3 points before I finish. The first is that although he'd been targeted for many years, it's only in the past 4 years, with the passing of the national security law in particular, that the authorities have been able to weaponize the law effectively to imprison Mr. Lai and shut down his newspaper. And you heard in other sessions, and those of you who were in the room for the session just beforehand, will have heard Rana Ayub talking about how we're now seeing a trend of laws being used against journalists, like fraud laws, regulatory laws, to try to slur the journalist, suggest that they're untrustworthy. Something I also see in the Philippines with my client Maria Ressa, something I saw in Pakistan with my client Mir Shakil or Raymond. And we also see that with Jimmy Lai, because he's targeted under the national security law. He's also been targeted in a bogus fraud case, and the idea is to paint him somehow as being untrustworthy, to send a message that this man is untrustworthy. And that's a tactic that we see in other cases, and his case is a very strong paradigm example of that. He also, of course, was targeted for his involvement in entirely peaceful protests. Now, Sebastien mentioned that case where he'd been to a vigil held on the 4th of June 2020. Every year, it's always held to mark the Tiananmen Square anniversary, very important to Mr. Lai. He attended for 15 minutes, lit a candle to honour the victims, said a prayer. His sentence, 13 months. That's what he got. Now, he's already served all of those sentences, 4 separate sets of sentences, without a whimper from the international community, without a whimper from the UK government publicly, despite him being a UK citizen. Now, second issue is, in the past 18 months in particular, we've started to see a deeply disturbing trend of the authorities in Hong Kong and in Beijing essentially trying to use transnational, extraterritorial threats, not just content with shutting down journalists and voices who are standing up to power within their own borders. They're now trying to target people extraterritorially. this remarkable woman sitting to my left sanctioned as a member of parliament in the UK because of her human rights work in relation to China about the Uyghurs' human rights. And members of the European Parliament also sanctioned. Benedict Rogers, who runs an incredible NGO, Hong Kong Watch, received a threat in London because of material he'd put on his website in London, saying, we think you violated the national security law and we're going to prosecute you unless you take material down off your website. Sebastien himself and I and members of my legal team threatened again with extraterritorial prosecution simply for doing our jobs and speaking out for our client. So that is another very concerning trend. That's an attempt to shut down not just the journalists, not just the media houses, but also their support network and their family members. So a very concerning trend and something we've got to stand up to. Now that's partly possible because the national security law is so breathtakingly broad. Essentially any form of dissent or any form of criticism of the authorities is somehow converted to a sedition or a terrorism offence, and it applies to anyone on the planet. You don't need to have ever stepped foot in Hong Kong. You don't need to have any connection to Hong Kong. You can be based in Perugia, you can be based in Washington, DC, you can be based in London, and you can receive a threat from the authorities under the national security law because of you speaking out, because of you liking something on Facebook, because of you posting something, even speaking to the United Nations about breach of international human rights. That, they say, is an offence. And thirdly, key question for all of us in the room today is, well, what can we do about this? And in the virtual room online, what can we do about these egregious attacks and what's happening to Jimmy Lai? And I have a few asks. I know Jason's going to have some more too. Many of you in the room are journalists. Tell the story. Shout this story from the rooftops. Journalists never want to become the story, but Jimmy Lai is the story here, and it's a story that must be told. Please also tell the story about how risky it is to do business in Hong Kong at the moment. We know the Hong Kong authorities are trying to send a message that it's business as usual, that the world needs to return and do business in Hong Kong, that it's a safe place for law firms to be based, it's a safe place for international investment banks to be based, and so on. You have got to tell the story that that is simply not true, because any other company could be targeted in the same way that Mr Lai, Apple Daily, Next Digital have been targeted. That can all happen under the national security law. Tell that story too, because that really has leverage and has an impact. Many of you here in the room are campaigners. You're from civil society organisations committed to freedom of expression and the rule of law. This case must be a top priority because of its importance to Jimmy Lai and his family, because of its importance for Hong Kong and the wider messages the case sends. Spread the word. You've seen hashtag Jimmy Lai, call for the charges to be dropped against Mr Lai and for him to be released from prison immediately. And the time is now. The national security law trial is due to take place in September. That is a trial which is going to take place using a fundamentally unfair law in a process which will not be fair to Mr Lai. And we've got to press for his release before we hit September. We've 5 months, we've got to use them. For those of you in or from the UK, remember that Mr Lai is a UK national, and yet the UK government has been disgracefully quiet on this case, in contrast to the European Union, in contrast to the US government, who give very strong statements. When Mr Lai, on the 25th of October last year, was convicted in this bogus fraud case, we saw a fantastic statement from the US government to say how disgraceful it was. His own government, the UK government, said nothing. And finally, I would say, all of you are concerned citizens, wherever you're from. Write to your own governments. Ask them to raise the case with the Hong Kong and Beijing authorities. Use your networks. If you know lawyers or those who work in finance who have Hong Kong links, give them the message that Hong Kong is not a safe place to do business. It's vital that we do that. Jimmy Lai stayed, as you've heard from Sebastien, in Hong Kong when he could have left and he could have been somewhere else. He decided to stay in the same way that Maria Ressa decided to stay in the Philippines. He stayed there to stand up for others, to speak out, to speak truth to power, to shine a light on anti-democratic and corrupt practices that were happening. He did that through his journalism, and now we have got to stand up for him. Thank you.
Caoilfhionn, if I'm arrested, I want you to act for me. Caoilfhionn has mentioned the ways in which the long arm of the state of China can reach well beyond its own boundaries, and many of us are experiencing that. I had a Twitter account created in my name, in which I became a great enthusiast for the oppressive actions of the Chinese regime, and have had a struggle getting Twitter to take it down. And so it's interesting the ways in which there are cyber attacks made on our against all of us, and we've all had interference with us and threats, and indeed Caoilfhionn hasn't mentioned it, but she's received serious threats for sexual nature, but threats against her children, threats against her life. And so we're talking about something quite, really, really serious, and the effects that it has on people. I want to also, before I bring in Jason, just to talk about the fact that the national security law is being used in insidious ways. For example, a trust was created some years back, and it gives monies for charitable purposes, and a number of leading Hong Kongers were on it, including Cardinal Zen, and Margaret Ng, a wonderful barrister who practices out there. I think Martin Lee, who's a senior counsel out there. A whole set of different people were on this, and they started during the recent protests by the students who were protesting against the extradition laws and the decrease in democracy. They started trying to raise money for legal aid, to pay for lawyers to represent people, to stop them going to jail. And they asked the expat population if they might send money, and because of that, they're being prosecuted under the national security law. Cardinal Zen is being prosecuted under the national security law. I haven't heard a peep out of the Vatican about that, and Italian journalists here just might want to raise the question as to why they haven't done anything about that, or about the others, because they were trying to raise money through this trust, but reaching out to people who lived abroad. They're being done under the national security law, and they're all being prosecuted. So this is going on in insidious ways inside Hong Kong, and there's no doubt that it's all about seeking to control and disempower the civilian population, but also to diminish democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. Well, you're a man who's had that horrible experience yourself, and I just wanted you, some of your reflections, because you had a pretty hellish time, and so tell us how that was, and what your message is to those of us who are concerned about Jimmy Lai.
Well, thank you very much, Helena. Thank you all for being here. Sebastian, Caoilfhionn, it's wonderful to be speaking together in solidarity for Jimmy. I spent a year and a half in prison in Iran because I was the Washington Post correspondent there. And I recognized that what happened to me was a really unique kind of abuse of power. I was a journalist being in prison, and I was an American being imprisoned by an adversarial state. And when something like that happens, the entire apparatus of a government, authoritarian state in this case, is mobilized, weaponized against you as an individual. Someone who spent his life and career trying to tell stories, trying to use my voice, first had my voice taken from me, was confined in solitary confinement, and then in complete isolation for the entire time that I was being held. The Iranian judiciary, acting in concert with the security services, the parliament calling for my execution, Iran's diplomatic corps traveling the world and sullying my name everywhere they could, and then the state media wings using their channels around the world to further make a case against me. So when I finally got out after a year and a half, I had a real kind of choice to make whether I wanted to stay in journalism or not. And when I did decide that this was what I was going to do, the attacks on other journalists around the world kind of became a natural beat for me to cover. It happened rather quickly. When I went back to work full-time at the Washington Post in 2018, it was right around the time that Jan Kuciak in Slovakia was murdered, and when Wallon and Chasu in Myanmar were arrested for uncovering a massacre of Rohingya Muslims. And so this became an essential piece of my work, and I'm looking out at the audience, at colleagues and friends who have experienced similar types of attacks, and it's commonplace in Iran or China or Syria or Venezuela. But what's really disconcerting is how we see it on the rise in formally functioning democracies. In the last panel, we heard from Maria and Rana. In India, you have a country that has more newspaper readers on a daily basis than there are Americans. And the impunity with which journalists are attacked, murdered. I don't think a single journalist who's been murdered in India has had their killer brought to justice. And so this is something that we really have to take seriously around the world. And in the case of Jimmy Lai, I think there are two really key points that stick out for me. Jimmy wasn't just a single journalist, he was a publisher. When Apple Daily was shut down, hundreds of journalists and all of the people in that ecosystem were put out of work. This is designed to silence not just one person, not just one company, but people with a voice. And when we talk about these national security laws, this is a trend that's happening in all of the countries that I just mentioned. It's just literally a way to stifle dissent and to prolong imprisonment and deny journalists in particular due process. And I think we have to call it out for that, because this is not just something that happens in Hong Kong. It's happening in Iran, where more than 100 journalists have been arrested in the last 7 months. In Russia, just this week, where in addition to Evan Gershkovich, who we'll be speaking about tomorrow, my Washington Post colleague, Vladimir Karamurza, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And I think one of the things that Lord Patton spoke about in the video that we watched earlier and that Keelan so eloquently talked about is the fact that Jimmy is a UK citizen. And correct me if I'm wrong, in the United Kingdom, like the United States, we don't have tiers of citizenship. You're either a citizen or you're not a citizen. And they have a responsibility not only to speak up for Jimmy, but to intervene on his behalf. And we see this happening more and more in the United States on cases of Americans who are deemed wrongfully detained. That's a new determination that the State Department has created in the last few years to essentially call out a foreign government for holding one of our nationals hostage. And I think the UK has similar systems in place, but they don't actively use them in the same kind of way.
Unfortunately, we're hearing radio silence on this, and partly I think it is because Brexit. Problems on Britain financially and economically, and maintaining trade around the world is of vital importance, and so therefore unfortunately it means that criticising China is something that they're very fearful of doing. So that's one of the great regrets here, is that there are rather muted noises made, but they're not going out fighting for a citizen who deserves to be fought for.
And I think that's the role that those of us who are here today and this weekend have, to stand up for Jimmy in our media outlets. As Keelan well knows, and we talked about the transnational threat to BBC Persian journalists and those working for news outlets in third countries, this is not a problem that just exists over there. These things touch our shores, and increasingly so. I'm constantly surprised when I talk to colleagues, even in my own newspaper, who don't know about these things that are happening to fellow journalists around the world. So I really appreciate the presence of all of you here, but for the folks here in Perugia to give us a platform to talk about these issues, because we talked about the rule of law and the importance of connection to freedom of expression. These are privileges that we call rights, but they can disappear very quickly, and unfortunately, Jimmy is a victim of that.
Jason, before you finish, I just wanted to say that pay tribute to you, because you came home after that experience of solitary confinement for 544 days, and you suffered your own forms of pain and anguish over that. I mean, I remember hearing you describe the business of having walked and circled a tiny cell that was 6 foot long and 4 feet wide, and finding yourself doing it in public spaces because it had become a rhythm to your life over that period, and the toll that it actually did take on you. And you're now clearly healed, but it was a terrible thing to be done to a man simply doing his job.
Thank you for acknowledging that, and I'll tell you, there's a selfish element to me taking part in these kinds of events and standing up for other journalists in trouble. It simply means that what I endured was not for naught.
Not for nothing.
And it really inspires me to keep moving forward. I'll keep doing this until journalists are no longer under threat anywhere in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to quickly ask if anyone has a question. I see a hand there, and I see a hand in the front row. If we can make it quite quick, because we're running out of time. Yeah.
I got a question for Sebastien.
Mm-hmm.
How many threats, which kind of threats did your family receive during these years, and how do you deal with that? Thank you.
So I still have family in Hong Kong at the moment, so if it's okay with you, I'd rather not share the...
It's a difficult thing just now for Sebastien to talk about the challenges that the family are facing. So
you can blame the lawyer for that. I'm not letting him talk about that.
Yeah, and I'm just going to let Rebecca ask her question very quickly, or if you've anything you wanted to say. I saw your hand up, but I want us to use the last couple of minutes for something else. So if you can just help us with your question.
Campaign action, so I'll keep this really brief. Just to add our voice from Reporters Without Borders, we campaign for Jimmy Lai as one of our top global priorities. This is one of the clearest examples of a truly emblematic case that I have ever worked on, not just for Hong Kong, but for the world. Just to put it into the context of the media freedom climate in Hong Kong, we have seen such a sharp deterioration in such a short space of time. It was the biggest fall in last year's World Press Freedom Index, falling from 81st to 148th in just 1 year. 28 journalists so far have been targeted using this national security legislation, 13 of whom are still in detention today, including 6 Apple Daily staff, and 7 media outlets have closed, completely decimating the media pluralism environment in Hong Kong. So when we campaign for Jimmy Lai, we're campaigning for press freedom in Hong Kong, but also globally, because our information systems are interlinked, and if this happens in Hong Kong, it impacts the whole world. So thank you so much to all of you
Rebecca,
for speaking so
for
powerfully.
that. And I'm going to give the last sentence to Keelan, because I've got a call to make to all of you.
Just really quickly, I just wanted to pay tribute to Rebecca Vincent from Reporters Without Borders, Jodie Ginsberg from CPJ, Julie Pissetti from ICFJ, and all the other organisations who've been supporting Sebastien, supporting Jimmy Lai, supporting the family and supporting us. We're hugely grateful. It's so important. We're really grateful to you for it. And final thing I wanted to say is Jason used the word selfish about the work that he does. I can't think of a word which is further from the truth. This is a man who is completely selfless, has been through something horrific himself, and is now using his platform to speak out for others, and we are so grateful.
Absolutely. Now, colleagues, friends, I want to ask you if you will all do something in your seat, because we want support for Jimmy Lai, and to say, we want freedom for him. We want freedom for Hong Kong. We want a return to democracy, media freedom, and the rule of law. Thank you all. That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to my panel. Thank you all for coming. And please remember that without journalists, we will not have democracies anywhere, and we all have to do it together. Thank you.